welcome to the Local Foods College. This is our 7th year of doing this educational forum. And the pictures here actually do give you a breadth of the stuff that we work on, everything from food and pollinators to greenhouses and grazing. This education platform is curated by and developed by the University of Minnesota Extension. The lead coordinator is Linda Kingery, who is the regional director for the in the Northwest, for the Regional Sustainable Development Partnerships. And she is part of a team of people from all around the state who work on this platform and create educational opportunities for you. Many of these opportunities have been developed right from the evaluations and responses and input that people have provided over the years. So we hope that they are valuable for you. So I want to introduce our speaker for the night. His name is Thaddeus McCammon. He comes from the Central Lakes College. Thaddeus grew up in Colorado and Montana and started working with fruit at an age of 12 by picking cherries, peaches, and apples, which sounds delightful. He also regularly ate every wild fruit that grows in both states. For the past 17 years, he has been working with fruit growers in Minnesota. The main crops he works with are apples, strawberries, blueberries, and raspberries. He has also overseen several projects looking at the commercial potential of new fruit crops, including goji berries, chokeberries, gooseberries, and pears. And with that, we will move on to Thaddeus's presentation.
For the last 2 years, I've been working with the Minnesota Institute of Sustainable Agriculture to write up guidelines and information about new crops. So if you look in the background, you see a poster of some strawberries, you see a poster of some apples. Well, this is not strawberries and apples. These are crops that typically have not had a lot of research. And as Anna mentioned in my introduction, I've been interested in this ever since I was a child. And I lived in areas of Montana and Colorado where there weren't a lot of fruit. So I ate anything that was remotely edible and grew on trees or bushes. And I started eating chokeberries when I was 8. So I was wondering, has anybody here ever eaten fresh chokeberries? But why is there an interest in this? First of all, somebody has eaten fresh chokeberries. Okay. Well, I guess
you can, if anybody wants to answer Thaddeus's questions, go ahead and use your green check marks and the red X marks there, and Thaddeus can see your answers.
And it looks like Brett said yes with a capital yes. And Susan has a bush in her yard, and they ate them growing up. And D. Kirk, yes, I have some in my backyard. Awesome.
Okay. When I talk about something sour, that gives you where my background is. I generally eat things that other people won't. So, but why is this interest in new crops? Well, first of all, there's new crops available. Part of it comes from the end of the Cold War when we got new plants that previously weren't available, especially from Eastern Europe and Northeast Asia. Northeast Asia, by the way, is one of the places where a lot of the really cold hardy new plants are coming from. Also, there's an interest in new local foods, new flavors. And the neat thing about a lot of this is when all is said and done, we don't need to import new fruit from anywhere. We could survive, if you really want to, get all the vitamin C you want from the crops that we'll be talking about tonight. But in addition, in the last 20 years, there's been a real interest in health benefits, unusual health benefits from certain crops. And I'll just go over this very briefly. I go into a lot more detail in the publication. So first of all, then everything I'm talking about, there's going to be vitamin C. Some of these crops have unusual vitamins like vitamin E, and almost all of them have antioxidants, which is good. I'm one of these people. I don't, by the way, I don't eat antioxidants in pills, but I love eating any fruit that's dark purple, which is primarily has anthocyanins, which are an important antioxidant. But there's also real probable medicinal properties in some of these new crops that I'll be covering tonight. So aronia has been shown to help in recovering heart attacks, for example, heart diseases, and it helps lessen the effect of diabetes. Whereas elderberries, which are shown on the right here, have been shown to, there's pretty good evidence that they have antiviral activity, and they can actually reduce colds and flus. Whereas black currants appear to have benefits as far as eyesight. Whereas sea berries, which I will be covering tonight, were actually developed by the Soviet scientists to help with skin care, especially for astronauts. So, but there's a lot of confusion about these because most of these are not ready for commercial production right now. And part of it is we need home gardeners, like many of you, to help us find out the best way to raise and harvest some of these. And one of the most critical things is we need to find out what is the best variety here. What's easiest to pick, what has the highest yields, what's the most disease resistance, because disease resistance can be really critical in Minnesota. And I see a lot of you are from southern Minnesota where disease is more important. Also, for commercial growers, a lot of these just don't have a market right now. And where there is a market, I will explain where that particular market is. So one of the things I always like to talk, one of the confusion about this is when we talk about strawberries, apples, pears, they were domesticated in some cases 1,000, 2,000 years ago. But when we're talking about most of these emerging crops, they're still in the process of being domesticated. And so some of the things that we don't like, the reason why we have these things that we don't like thorns, astringency, we don't have in a lot of domesticated crops. And the example I always give is pears. Pears are naturally astringent. They have that same drying taste that you get when you eat a chokeberry, but pears were domesticated 2,000 years ago, and that's been bred out. By the way, nobody's going to release and name a new variety of pear that is astringent. But when we look at wild plants, there's high genetic variability. Now, a lot of times people think, well, that's really good to have all this genetic variability. It is not good if you have chokeberries that ripen at over a course of a month. So one bush is ripe on July 10th, another bush is ripe on August 1st, and so you never really get enough to make a thing of chokeberry jelly. The other issue we ran into with Goji berries is we planted some seedlings, and we had 50 seedlings, and 49 of them were not acceptable for any use whatsoever. So because of this, we start domesticating plants. And when we domesticate plants, we choose wild plants. First of all, we choose wild plants with desirable fruit. And usually with these crops, we're only looking at fruit. We're not looking at anything else. And then we propagate them asexually, so with cuttings and grafting, things like that. And examples that I'll be covering tonight that are in stage 1 are our Saskatoons, clove currants, aronia, and elderberries. Stage 2, I just call that simple breeding, 1 or 2 crosses, and we're still looking for fruit quality. And a lot of these are in this stage 2, which would be hardy kiwi, goji, haskap's, and sea berries. And then stage 3 is everything else. There's where there's extensive breeding. There's different, scientists have different lines for disease resistance and other characteristics. And the plants that have been domesticated the longest here would be black currants and gooseberries. And also you can see that black currants are in stage 3, clove currants are in stage 1. Actually, some of them are wild. A lot of these plants that are in stage 1 are actually North American natives. We're way behind in domesticating compared to other parts of the world. So I start out with currants. And I start out with currants because I think they have the biggest potential for commercial production. Currants are a huge crop in Eastern Europe and in Russia. Actually, Russia all the way to the Pacific Ocean. And currants, all currants are upright shrubs. The maximum height is about 6 to 8 feet. And they get really confusing because there's 3 sections. And within these 3 sections, in most cases, there are multiple species. So there's the red currants, and the white currants are actually red currants that don't have red color. And then there's the black currants, and I'll go into more detail on all of these. And then finally, there's the Native American clove currant. And if you look at the scientific name, it's Ribes aureum, that's golden currant. I don't know why it's called golden currant. I'll talk about why it's called a clove currant. And there's some disease issues with these. Now, first of all, with currants and gooseberries, they belong to the same genus. And they were outlawed in the 1930s, 1920s and 30s because they are an alternate host for white pine blister rust. Now, in Norway, they were oftentimes more concerned about currants than they were in white pines, whereas in North America, they were more concerned about white pines than currants, and so they thought they could control white pine blister rust by outlawing all Ribes production in the United States. It didn't work. They even had people in North Idaho walking through the forest trying to pull every currant that they could find. It didn't work, and in 1969, they were legalized again. But currants have been very slow gaining popularity, currants and gooseberries. For a number of reasons, they've been slow. And the big thing here is your Norwegian or German grandmother didn't have any currants, didn't have any gooseberries to cook with, and so a lot of those recipes, a lot of those traditions have been lost. What I find in this state is cane borers and powdery mildew actually have a bigger problem, especially in southern Minnesota, where a lot of you are listening from, than white pine blister rust. And what we find, especially with cane borers, I've only seen that in the metro area. I haven't seen it in northwestern Minnesota. And powdery mildew, it does tend to get better the farther northwest you go in the state. So what do you use currants for? Well, you don't use dried currants. That's actually great. Whenever you go to the grocery store or gourmet store and they talk about currants, those are grapes, dried currants. But there's a big use for wine. It's a pretty sour wine, I might say. It's also used for jams and jellies. But one of the main uses worldwide for currants is juice. And before oranges became widespread, currant juice, both red and black, was a major source of vitamin C. In fact, in England, during World War II, when the oranges were cut off, supply of oranges was cut off, they actually developed a drink called Ribena with black currants that's still being used today. Also, you can do a lot of cooking with black currants. I like to braise cabbage, sometimes beef with red currants. So red currants worldwide are not the most common, but I find that a lot of people in Minnesota and Wisconsin prefer red currants. They tend to be more disease resistant than black currants. And also for people who were born in the United States, the flavor is a little more appealing. They're a little easier to eat fresh. White currants, by the way, are actually bred to eat fresh, but I found that even I can't eat a lot of white currants at one sitting. One thing I really like about red currants is they are higher yields and they're easier to pick than black currants. And as opposed to black currants, they ripen evenly in the cluster. So when you see a little cluster of fruit like I have here, you can strip everything off. Whereas sometimes with blacks, you have to pick each cluster twice. Some of the varieties have large seeds, which can be an issue. And the currants I have in my at my place, I actually have to separate the seeds out. They cannot be consumed. Not all red currants are that way. But black currants worldwide are way more common, and they are really, in Eastern Europe and Russia, Eastern Europeans and Russians love black currants. And most of the black currants that are being sold in Minnesota are actually sold to immigrants from, say, the Ukraine, Russia, Poland, places like that.
Thaddeus?
Yes?
We have a question
Yes.
from Miranda. She asks, are black currants mealy in texture when making jam?
No, they shouldn't be. No, they make a really good jam.
Good.
So, yeah, if they were mealy in texture, no. So, no, they tend to be really juicy if they're picked correctly. And the jam is very good, by the way. A lot of times people use it, you know, they eat it, and Russians will actually eat it with beef. I think black currants are inevitable as a crop in Minnesota, largely because of they're loaded with phytonutrients. They're excellent for you. They're a little harder to pick, and I say they taste a little like pine sap. Some of that might be a little harsh, but for processing, they're very good. The juice is very good. The juice, by the way, tastes very different than red currant juice. Red currant juice actually tastes more like lemonade, whereas the black currant has a much richer flavor. So they are more susceptible to leaf diseases than red currants. So I recommend, most of you are in southern Minnesota, I really recommend if you're going to try black currants that you try to find varieties that are resistant to white pine blister rust. And I didn't have a rust in there, but white pine blister rust resistant varieties. And I have, in the publication, I have a list of all the varieties. Remember, black currants have been around for 400 years. There are actually hundreds of varieties. Only about a dozen are so available in the United States. And there's going to be more coming to the United States over the next few years. But I like clove currants. Not everybody likes clove currants. I do. Part of it is we had one in Colorado, and they are the only currant or gooseberry with fragrant flowers, with showy flowers and fragrant flowers. And in my biased opinion, I think they're worth planting just for the flowers. You can smell the flowers, which smell like cloves, by the way, for 10 yards away. They also tend to be more disease resistant because they are native to North America, Central North America, and the fruit are pretty easy to eat fresh. The reason why they're not more popular among people who are growing currants is they tend to have fairly low yields. But I think if we choose the right varieties, that can happen. Crandell, by the way, is the only variety that I know of. Oftentimes it's listed under the species Ribes odoratum, and it was selected for the flowers, not for the fruit. But the fruit is very edible. I eat it all the time. So now we go to the closely related gooseberries, which tend to be small shrubs. And gooseberries, one reason why they're not more popular is that they were replaced by seedless grapes, especially in England, where there was a big gooseberry production before World War II. The fruit can be red, yellow, orange, or green, and they tend to be sour. And so the picture I have here is Hinnomaki red. It is considered too sour for fresh consumption, but it's really good for pastries and stuff. I love to make pies and other pastries with Hinnomaki red. And it also can be used for wine. Now, the other thing, too, I just want to emphasize is a lot of these don't need to be used for, can have double uses. I live next to a road where there's a lot of snowmobiles. I don't mind if the snowmobiles are next to the road. I don't like them turning around in my yard. So I planted a lot of thorny gooseberries. It has really worked really well. I currently have a crop or a grant where we're looking at new gooseberry varieties. What's the potential? And I think there is a potential because they do have a unique taste, especially if you use the right varieties. And one of the reasons why I think gooseberries aren't more popular is for 40 years the only gooseberry variety listed in most seed catalogs was Pixwell, and I just don't think it's that good of a variety. Some of these others have really nice tasting fruit for good, especially for fresh eating. Some of them are actually quite sweet, but they are difficult to harvest. The biggest disease, yes?
I'm sorry, are they native? We had a question about gooseberries being native to Minnesota.
Yes, they are native. There's one variety called John's Prairie, Jahn, which is actually a wild selection from Canada. The domesticated ones are actually, most of them are from Europe, with the exception of John's Prairie. And yeah, and also when you get into the wild, sometimes the difference between gooseberry and currant, it's hard to even know which, if the wild one in your backyard is a gooseberry or a currant. The biggest disease problem we have is powdery mildew. And they oftentimes are defoliated by the middle of August. And we're working on that, by the way. So we need to find which varieties are better. We need to find out what the market is. And I really think if we get good varieties, they'll be easier to sell. And we'll have more information on that in a few years. I'm also really concerned about this powdery mildew, which I think we're slowly getting a handle on it. One of the big things is we need to develop training systems. So I talked to a guy last week from Massachusetts who actually is selling 4 acres of gooseberries, and he has everything trained just like this. It's trained on a wire, and okay, I could. It's trained on a wire here, so that the berries are hanging below the wire, and that way you don't get stabbed whenever you're trying to pick them. Getting stabbed is very easy when you're trying to pick gooseberries. Some people are using gloves, but this commercial harvester is just able to avoid that problem by training them on this trellis. And we'll see what happens. Yes?
There's another question. Is white pine rust prevalent in Hubbard County? They have a lot of white pine forests.
Yes. It's pretty much across the state. So in Hubbard County, that would be even worse. Okay, if there's white pines, you will have white pine blister rust, unfortunately.
Great, thanks. That answered our question. Thank you.
There's a lot of interest in honeyberries or haskaps, and they're a very new crop from the Russian Far East in the northernmost island of Japan, Hokkaido. Now, the honeyberry, the first thing I always like to say is the name comes from honeysuckle. It does not come because they taste like honey. The name haskap refers specifically to honeyberries from the island of Hokkaido, where a lot of the new varieties are coming from. They tend to be low-growing bushes, but there's some big differences between varietals. And the berries are born in twin flowers, just like the Tartarian honeysuckle that's so common in windbreaks. And of course, the fruit, as you can see, are also found as twins. There we go. And it's odd-shaped fruit. To me, this is one of the problems with honeyberries. Some of them look like purple caterpillars. Some of them look pretty nice here. And the flavor, one of the things it has going for it, there's a number of things they have going for them. One is the flavor, especially processed, not so much fresh. The flavor is similar to blueberries, and it can be an alternative for blueberries if you are in alkaline soils. They also to have frost-tolerant blossoms. I have seen this in the field. The blossoms actually can handle temperatures um, in the mid to low 20s, which is very unusual for any fruit crop. So I think there's a lot of promise because I like the fruit. The fruit is really good in ice cream because it's so intensely flavored and dark colored. Pastries, I had some preserves last week, and it almost made me feel good just having 1 tablespoon. Not a lot of diseases. There is a powdery mildew that's a problem. I'll have a picture of it in the next slide. And they also ripen very early. The biggest problem we're running into is yields. The yields just aren't that high, especially compared to blueberries. And I've had a lot of discussions with people. I see low blossom numbers as being an issue. Other people think it's pollination. And if you look at this flower, there's a really long tube here. And so not everything can pollinate this flower. We prefer to have bumblebees. Another problem is they bloom so early, sometimes there's not a lot of bumblebees out. So they will bloom the first week of April in some cases. And the other thing, I say slow to harvest. I mean, they're slow to pick. A lot of times people just aren't able to pick enough to make it commercially viable. But in a yard, there's no reason not to have one of these. But choosing one is going to be really tough because there are so many varieties. And by the way, there's a number of commercial orchards being planted in Minnesota, in Quebec, in Poland, in Scotland. And one of the problems is there's so many new varieties being released. And there's basically 3 programs. There's a private company in Arkansas, and Lydia Delafield, she's from Russia, a really impressive woman. I'm just really impressed with what she's doing. And so she's primarily choosing varieties out of Russia. Maxine Thompson is a retired horticulture professor at Oregon State University, and she primarily is releasing varieties from Japan. And then Bob Moores from Saskatchewan is doing a lot of different crosses. And some people say, "Oh, my plants yield a lot. I don't know what variety that is." And I think if we can get the yield up, it's going to really have a good potential. But we're still trying to figure out pruning and training. I think they should be pruned mainly because they are, as you can see on this really good picture, the flowers are produced on new growth, and so I think we need a fair amount of pruning so that we can get more new growth for more flowers.
All right, I have a couple questions about honeyberries.
Oh yeah, I would expect that.
I know, they're so great. I want some myself. There was a question from Hillary who was wondering about hummingbirds. Are they a crop that hummingbirds enjoy?
It depends on if the hummingbirds are there when they bloom. In some cases, they're going to be blooming before the hummingbirds arrive. And that's going to depend on variety. It's going to depend on the year, whether it's an early spring or a late spring. A late spring, yes, I think the hummingbirds. Yeah, when you look at it, yeah, it looks perfect for hummingbirds. Great question. I've never gotten that question before.
I know, and you can tell with that kind of blossom, that's a really good question. And then there's another question or sort of a statement from Miranda, who says she has 12 honeyberries but hardly gets any fruits. They're covered with blossoms, just a few berries. So she doesn't ask, but I'm kind of inferring that she's kind of curious if you have any insight into why that might be.
That sounds like a lack of bumblebees.
Oh.
And the other question is, are they blooming too early before the bumblebees are out, which has been a big issue. So.
Oh, interesting. Well, I suppose can she plant anything around that would bring them?
Oh, the other thing is she has to have several varieties too. Because they are self-infertile. I did not put that in there, and Connie, that's something that should be put in there, is you need multiple varieties. The other issue is there's a lot of genetic variability, and not only do you need more than one variety, you need 2 varieties that bloom at the same time. So if there's a week difference in blooming, they may not pollinate.
Oh, interesting.
Good, really good
I
question.
know, really good questions. I just want to just double check. Yes, and then Mary Lee just mentioned Honeyberry USA is from Clearwater County, and they sell plants there, just for anybody who's interested.
Yeah, honeyberryusa.com sells plugs. Yeah, and also there's a place in Arkansas is selling some as well. So Saskatoons, there's a lot of interest in Saskatoons. They're related to apples and pears, which is a pet peeve of mine, as you'll find out in a slide or two. And a Saskatoon belongs to the species Amblanchia alniflora, and they are from Saskatchewan. And I always like to point out that the city of Saskatoon was named after the berry. The berry was not named after the city. A juneberry are ones that haven't been domesticated. They are native to Minnesota, and they're pretty much anywhere in the state. And I'll talk a little bit about other species of juneberries that within the same genus, just a little bit. So this is my pet peeve. There is a nursery that likes to advertise new Saskatoon blueberries doesn't require acidic soil. Saskatoons are not blueberries. They are juneberries. They are service berries. They are shadberries. They are sarvice berries, what we call them in Colorado. But they are not blueberries. They are right. They do not require acidic soil. They actually handle alkaline soil pretty well. But they taste very different. They are susceptible to very different to different diseases as well, which is really critical. They can be eaten fresh, but they have large seeds. When I talked to my brothers and sisters, they didn't like them because the seeds. I didn't like them too much because they don't have a lot of acidity. It doesn't give a real round flavor. But they are really good for being processed. And if any of you have ever eaten an apple seed, you know it has kind of an almond flavor. Well, in Saskatoons, they're closely related, and that almond flavor is released when it's cooked. And so when you make a Saskatoon or a juneberry pie, you never add almond flavor. It's almost overwhelming. The other thing is, since it's a low-acid fruit, you can combine it with an acidic fruit or with rhubarb, and you can make some really nice jams, ice cream toppings, pies, and there's a little bit of wine. They're mainly grown, of course, in Canada and in any of the prairie provinces in Canada. So there's a lot of uses, good yields. They're easy to pick. In the prairie, they're really good. And I put this in here because it's one of the few plants that we can propagate by seed. They do come true to seed to a certain extent, unlike any other crop I'm talking about. But the problem is they are bird magnets. And it is one of the few berries I know that the birds don't wait until they're ripe. They turn red, and the robins will pick every berry on there. In Minnesota, we are really struggling with leaf diseases. We don't really know what the disease is, but they are defoliating the plants usually by August. So we also need suitable varieties for the Midwest, and that's what I want other people to do. So a lot of people have tried these commercially, and very few people have succeeded, mainly because the leaf diseases in the birds. You just can't wait until they turn purple to put a bird netting on. We're also finding a number of insect pests. And what I'm recommending right now, if you're really interested, don't try the Saskatoons, but try another species. The fruit is surprisingly similar between species. The disease resistance is not. Some of these other some of these other species, like glandiflora, are resistant. One of them is called Autumn Blaze, and it has brilliant color in the fall and good fruit in the summer. Some of them that were come out of Wisconsin have names of royalty. So there's a Princess Diana, Princess William, and all of those should be hardy, especially in southern Minnesota. And I was at the University of Chicago campus embarrassing my daughter by eating juneberries on a tree growing in the middle of campus, and I thought they were just as good as a Saskatoon.
I did the very same thing. My boss took me around campus, and we did a eating tour, so it was great.
Yeah, and that's a weird thing. Usually the fruit really varies, and the trees vary, but here the fruit doesn't vary much from whether you're talking about some of the eastern species versus the western species. And I always do Saskatoons and Aronia together because they are closely related. They're actually palm fruit similar to apples and pears. And they actually, for most of American history, they were used as an ornamental under the name black chokeberry. Of course, there's two problems with the name chokeberry. One, it is confused with chokecherry, and even I get that confused. When I did a taste test with these things, of course, I couldn't say chokeberry because people would think it was chokecherry. And also people, the name choke turns people off. But they were actually, even though they're native to North America, they were developed as a fruit crop in Eastern Europe. And then the Soviets, long before anybody was talking about antioxidants and phytonutrients, the Soviets were developing this for its health benefits. And the ones with edible fruit that are grown for fruit with a large fruit tend to be a fairly tall shrub, sometimes 15 to 20 feet tall. And these were reintroduced into the United States in the early 2000s. I think they might actually be a cross with mountain ash too, which is why they're so tall. And the main interest is by large food manufacturers for energy drinks, and they are blended typically. Most of the Aronia juice that's being used in the various energy drinks actually comes from the Ukraine. It's imported as juice. And so a lot of people are interested in saying, well, we can grow them here in the United States. Unfortunately, the market collapsed. So there's a real potential for overproduction with Aronia. In Iowa, I hear people talking about insect pests and diseases. I haven't seen any of those in Minnesota. I haven't seen any diseases enough to really worry about. They do need to be pruned, by the way. But the problem is the market's pretty low. So we need more uses for the fruit. And there's one organic grower near La Crosse who makes this plum Aronia jam that is absolutely out of this world. So if you find the right uses, there's more of a future for this. And I always say, if you know any Russian friends, talk to them and see what they do with them as well. Elderberries. There's actually 3 edible species. And the edible species, this is really critical because there is a red species native to Minnesota, but all of the black species have edible fruit. And the red species does not. So the European species, it's not planted here very often. But I meant this is the only case where I actually have varieties, 2 varieties actually out of Denmark that are reportedly hardy to zone 3. And actually, I might be planting some of these here in Staples this year because we're not having a lot of success with the American ones, which I'll explain a little later. But American species, this would be Eastern North America, they bear fruit on first-year canes. And that's what the commercial people are doing. They mow the canes down every year. Then you don't have to worry about winter injury. The problem we're running into here in Staples is our growing season just isn't long enough for the fruit to ripen if the cane is sprouting this in the spring. I would also I'm encouraging people to try the blue elderberry from especially the blue elderberry from western Montana and northern Idaho, which could be hardy, especially in southern Minnesota. It is not domesticated. The fruit quality is very good. But I'm a Westerner, so I am biased, excuse me. There's a lot of things you can do with elderberry. The color is great. It makes great coloring for a lot of things, really deep purple. One thing people like are those large, they're called cymes. They're easy to pick. But this is a critical thing. I'll show the picture. You have to remove the berries from the cyme. And for small growers, that's a little bit of a problem. So a lot of people have machines that do that. The cyme does contain cyanide compounds, so you want to minimize the amount of cyme when you're making jelly. I have done taste tests with this, especially when I lived in the Northwest. People really like it. But elderberries can also be used for the flowers. And if you don't have time to ripen the berries, you can use the flowers. A lot of times this is being used commercially in teas, wine, and in juice. Very popular in Northern Europe, by the way. My daughter's living on the Germany-Denmark border, and she's really gotten into elderflower tea, in spite of me. So, and the medicinal value is both in the fruit and the flowers. So you can go to CVS Pharmacy and buy Sambucol, which is not a lot different than the jelly that I've made. Elderberry is really hard to get to gel, and I always ended up with syrup, and it doesn't taste a lot different than this Sambucol, which I bought last year. So I honestly don't know where the Sambucol is coming. Most of the medicinal ones that are being used in the United States come from the North American species. Oh, this is nice. They like a heavier soil. They can handle a little bit of wet feet better than any other crop we're working with. They bloom in summer when there's no concern about frost. And in Minnesota, as I mentioned, they're mowing the canes to the ground every year. But I don't think that system is suitable for staples north. One of my concerns, too, is most of the new varieties out of Missouri are here. And that's just too far south. You know, they might be hardy, but I'm not sure we can get the fruit to ripen. That's why I'm encouraging people to try varieties from Europe or varieties or seedlings from Idaho. There's a good future for elderberries. There's a good market. It's an excellent tasting product. A lot of the European varieties, by the way, you have to be careful. A lot of them were actually selected as ornamental, but you can be used for edible landscaping. They've got big, nice flowers that bloom in the middle of summer, attract lots of pollinators. But especially in central and northern Minnesota, I think we should be experimenting.
There's a question about Sambucol.
Yes.
And wondering what form it takes. Is it tablets, capsules, gel?
Actually, they have capsules, and some of it's a cough syrup, which I had last year. So, yes. So there's also a lot of interest in hardy kiwis or actinidia. I like this scientific name for a number of reasons. And this actually goes much farther back in Minnesota than most people realize. Because it was introduced as an ornamental. At the time, people liked plants that crawled up, that grew up the sides of buildings. A lot of the English ivy and stuff was not hardy in Minnesota, so they found these vines in China and Korea that grew very well in Minnesota. And then they realized, oh, they produce fruit as well. Now, the name kiwi it's kind of weird how that happened. Is there was another species from China again, and some people in New Zealand started developed them for commercial production. And since they were in New Zealand, they decided, well, nobody's going to buy a Chinese gooseberry. We'll call them kiwi fruit. And so then after kiwis became popular as a fresh fruit in the 1970s, people started looking at these other species and the name sort of stuck, even though none of these are from New Zealand. Most of them are directly from East Asia. Now, the difference between the hardy actinidia and the ones that you buy in the store is the skin is edible. And there's male and female plants, so you always need to get a male one, one male to about 5 to 7 females. And there's actually 3 species and several interspecific hybrids. And I do like to talk about the species because they are distinct. The one that's most hardy that people are most interested in is the Actinidia colomitica, oftentimes called extra hardy kiwi or Arctic beauty. It's a zone 2 plant, by the way. And the male plants have variegated leaves, so it's often used as an ornamental that way. People are struggling with the fruit on these. The fruit that more people are interested in is from Actinidia arguta, which is often called the bower vine. And you can see there's red petioles. That's one of the distinctive features of the bower vine. It has larger fruit, and this is the species where we think there is commercial potential. We're still trying to find varieties and everything, but there's but the problem is it's irregular production, and nobody has yet to make money off of Actinidia arguta. Difficult to pick. That could change next year. There's a lot of potential for all 3 of these species. But I was interested in the silver vine, which, by the way, I guess attracts cat. It's similar to catnip. Most everybody says the fruit is marginal, but it also has the prettiest flowers. And that's one thing with any of these. They are fantastic ornamentals for arbors, things like that. And then if you get fruit, it's really nice. So, a lot of interest in goji berries. Now, one of the interesting things is these are a perennial. It's a shrub or a vine, and they are in the tomato family, which is unusual. But they do have a fruit, a nice berry that is easy to eat, fresh. And this is native to northern China. So most of this would actually be on the northwest China, which is really cold. So they are cold hardy. What we found is some varieties are susceptible to early blight in tomatoes. That appeared to be a bigger problem than the cold hardiness. The biggest problem, if you look in any catalog, there's like 4 varieties. And when I talked to a woman from southern China about this, and the first thing she said is, we don't grow them for the fruit, we grow them for the leaves, which is probably one reason why in Montana, where they're actually an invasive species, they don't produce fruit hardly at all. I think when the Chinese introduced them to Montana, they were, again, growing them mainly for the leaves. But Americans want fruit, and that's probably one reason why we don't have as many varieties as we should. So there was a new variety. It's not even named in many seed catalogs that is listed for Zone 3. I really hope people try it to see if it's going to work. You can do what we did near Rush City, which was planted a bunch of seeds, and we found 1 out of 50 plants. We did 50 seedlings. We did find one that did have potential. It definitely had potential, but I didn't know how to propagate it. I was really busy at the time. And by the way, if you don't propagate by seedlings, it just didn't work. But you can plant a lot of seedlings to see if 1 or 2 will be good enough. As far as commercially, I'm not real gung-ho on this because labor is just way more expensive in this country than in China. You know, like 95% of the goji berries are actually coming from China. There also is concern for it being aggressive, more so in Montana than here. And then finally, I'll talk a little bit about sea berries, which are also native to Central Asia, phenomenally hardy. In sea berries, the name sea berry comes because in Western Europe, they grow along in sand dunes next to the ocean. Sea buckthorn comes because it has thorns, really nasty thorns, I should mention. And then buckthorn has such a bad name in this state that they got rid of the buckthorn, and now they just call it sea berries. They are drought tolerant, frost tolerant, and like the actinidia, we also have male and female plants. And if you're looking at varieties, all the varieties are females. I don't think anybody's ever registered a male variety. And here's something really unusual. The only fruit I know of in this area that is wind pollinated. And so, again, it's about a 1 to 5 ratio between male and females. And by the way, do not plant seedlings. They just don't have good fruit. You need to get a registered variety, and there's new coming out all the time. And the health benefit is the skin. This, by the way, not only is high in vitamin C, it's high in vitamin A and E. Just incredibly rich in a lot of different things. One of the problems people are running into is they are hard to pick. These little berries, the size of a small blueberry, they stick to the plant. You can't shake the plant. They don't shake off. And there's thorns. So what a lot of people are doing is they cut the branches and then freeze the whole branch and then just take the fruit off afterwards. I have eaten as many different varieties as I possibly could, and I have yet to find a variety that I can eat twice, eat more than one berry. But I think with the right juice, especially these phenomenal health benefits, I think there is a future. But it also it's been planted in Minnesota for 70 years as edible landscaping, by the way, actually as an ornamental. Now we're finding out, yeah, not only can you eat the fruit, the fruit are good for you. They do spread underground by rootstockers, very aggressive, and so they need to be mowed. By the way, they can't handle shade. This is a desert plant, and so it does like full sun. It can't compete against a tree overhead. And if you're interested in, Russian immigrants are looking for these. And there's about 7 or 8 varieties that have the fruit quality and the fruit yield to be of interest. And some of the new varieties, by the way, are red. So a light to dark red, which I think is really interesting. And myself, I like that dark red color. So I think there's a color future.
Thaddeus, what's the genus of sea berries? What's the genus of sea berries?
Hippophoe. Hippophoe. I'll put it in the. They are related to. Let's see. They're related to buffalo berries and it's in the Alagniaceae family, but hippo, just like a hippo, and then O-P-H-A-E. And that's because they used to feed them to horses because they'd give the horses shiny skins.
Huh, interesting.
Oh, I'm seeing all these chats. Oh, I didn't know about that.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
No worries, that's why I'm here. I have a couple of questions if you're willing. It is 7 o'clock, and that's usually when we hang it up. But if people are willing to hang out a little bit, that would.
Actually, excuse me. The goji leaves were put in soups.
There you go. Yep.
According to my Chinese friend. Okay.
Good. That got one question answered. There was a question earlier on about I'm going to probably mispronounce it, but Drosophila, I think it's the fruit fly. Are any of these varieties?
Spotted wing Drosophila.
There we go. Are any of the varieties that we've talked about particularly susceptible?
No. Honeyberries would be the most susceptible, but they actually ripen before the spotted wing Drosophila become a problem. That's one nice thing. Okay. The one that I would be most concerned with would be goji berries. I would, when you look at the color and the skin color of this, with the thin skin of goji berries, yeah, that's the one I think would be a problem.
Interesting. And then another question that came up was, again, with the hummingbirds, there's another question about whether there are any particular honeyberry cultivars that might be particularly good for hummingbirds. If you have any insight on that.
It's such a new crop. I would just say again, experiment. Yeah.
Good. And then lastly, Mary Lee had a question about her hardy kiwi. She's never gotten flowers or fruit. Any reason that you could surmise?
Well, she has several hardy kiwis. Actually, she's in Beltrami County,
Yeah.
and some of these are not very hardy. So it depends on what species. So if it is the Actinidia colomitica, by all means it should be blooming. But if it's Actinidia, this is speculation. But whereas if it's Actinidia arguta, it would be, it may not be hardy, and of course, flower buds are usually the first thing to die during winter hardiness. And well, she doesn't have any flowers. Oh, well, yeah, yeah, yeah. I need to see how. Yeah, most of them have pretty showy flowers, so you should be able to see them.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right.
And by the way, one of the things I didn't mention about elderberries I think is really critical is traditionally the native range of the American elderberry, there's a question about elderberries, was actually the Minnesota-Iowa border. That was the northern limit. Now there's quite a few native black elderberries growing in the southern metro area. So they have moved up from some of the books I've seen.
Great. Anything else anybody wants to ask? Otherwise, we'll bring the presentation to a close. I've got a few more remarks, and then we'll call it a night.